Episode number 26. "Oh, don't cry, Mrs. Goldbach," said Kay, looking out the window. He was thinking only of Miss Westner, and how she was accepting an unknown girl into her home. "Now don't cry," he said again as he turned his look back into the room, where Mrs. Goldbach was still crying. "I meant no harm either when I said that. It was simply a misunderstanding between us. That can happen even between old friends sometimes." Mrs. Goldbach pulled her apron down to below her eyes to see whether Kay really was attempting a reconciliation. "Well, yes, that's how it is," said Kay, and as Mrs. Goldbach's behavior indicated that the captain had said nothing he dared to add, "Do you really think, then, that I'd want to make an enemy of you for the sake of a girl we hardly know?" "Yes, you're quite right, Mr. Kay," said Mrs. Goldbach, and then, to her misfortune, as soon as she felt just a little freer to speak, she added something rather inept. "I kept asking myself why it was that Mr. Kay took such an interest in Miss Westner. Why does he quarrel with me over her when he knows that a cross word from him, and I can't sleep that night? And I didn't say anything about Miss Westner that I hadn't seen with my own eyes." Kay said nothing in reply. He should have chased her from the room as soon as she had opened her mouth, and he didn't want to do that. He contented himself with merely drinking his coffee and letting Mrs. Goldbach feel that she was superfluous. Outside, the dragging steps of Miss Montag could still be heard as she went from one side of the hallway to the other. "Do you hear that?" asked Kay, pointing his hand at the door. "Yes," said Mrs. Goldbach with a sigh. "I wanted to give her some help, and I wanted the maid to help her too, but she's stubborn. She wants to move everything in herself. I wonder at Miss Westner. I often feel it's a burden for me to have Miss Montag as a tenant, but Miss Westner accepts her into her home with herself." "There's nothing there for you to worry about," said Kay, crushing the remains of a sugar lump in his cup. "Does she cause you any trouble?" "No," said Mrs. Goldbach. "In itself it's very good to have her there. It makes another room free for me, and I can let my nephew, the captain, occupy it. I began to worry he might be disturbing you when I had to let him live in the living room next to you over the last few days. He's not very considerate." "What an idea," said Kay, standing up. "There's no question of that. You seem to think that, because I can't stand this toing and froing of Miss Montag, that I'm oversensitive, and there she goes back again." Mrs. Goldbach appeared quite powerless. "Should I tell her to leave moving the rest of her things over till later, then, Mr. Kay? If that's what you want, I'll do it immediately." "But she has to move in with Miss Westner," said Kay. "Yes," said Mrs. Goldbach, without quite understanding what Kay meant. "So she has to take her things over there." Mrs. Goldbach just nodded. Kay was irritated all the more by this dumb helplessness which, seen from the outside, could have seemed like a kind of defiance on her part. He began to walk up and down the room between the window and the door, thus depriving Mrs. Goldbach of the chance to leave, which she otherwise probably would have done. Just as Kay once more reached the door, someone knocked at it. It was the maid, to say that Miss Montag would like to have a few words with Mr. Kay, and therefore requested that he come to the dining room where she was waiting for him. Kay heard the maid out thoughtfully, and then looked back at the shocked Mrs. Goldbach in a way that was almost contemptuous. His look seemed to saying that Kay had been expecting this invitation for Miss Montag for a long time, and that it was confirmation of the suffering he had been made to endure that Sunday morning from Mrs. Goldbach's tenants. He sent the maid back with the reply that he was on his way. Then he went to the wardrobe to change his coat, and in answer to Mrs. Goldbach's gentle whining about the nuisance Miss Montag was causing, merely asked her to clear away the breakfast things. "But you've hardly touched it," said Mrs. Goldbach. "Oh, just take it away," shouted Kay. It seemed to him that Miss Montag was mixed up in everything, and made it repulsive to him.